The following Easter, I sat at the head of a long walnut table surrounded by people who had chosen truth over pretense, and for the first time in years, the silence around me felt peaceful instead of lonely. The old farmhouse was glowing with candlelight, the scent of baked ham and rosemary rolls drifting through rooms that had once witnessed too much humiliation. Chloe laughed in the kitchen. Daniel carved the roast with the same steady hands his father once had, and every chair at my table was filled. But it was not the beauty of that afternoon that made it unforgettable. It was what had happened 6 months earlier, when Vanessa's lies finally collapsed under their own weight. At what she thought would be my public embarrassment, she had instead walked into her own undoing. The moment I read aloud the messages she had sent relatives claiming I was unstable, manipulative, and too confused to be trusted around the grandchildren, the room shifted. Then came the second envelope. The financial records. Quietly gathered, carefully verified. Years of redirected family gifts, a college fund she had borrowed against without telling Daniel, church donations she had pledged in our family's name but routed through an account she controlled. It wasn't scandal born from rumor. It was documented fraud wrapped in polished manners. When Daniel saw the statements, his face changed in a way only a mother can recognize. It was the look of a son seeing truth too late. Within weeks, Vanessa was removed as treasurer from the charity board she had built her social standing on. The women who once praised her elegance stopped returning her calls. Her name disappeared from 2 fundraising committees. Her consulting contract was quietly terminated after questions surfaced about expense reimbursements. Then came the legal settlement. Because the money drawn from Chloe's education trust had been unauthorized, Vanessa signed a restitution agreement that required full repayment with penalties. She sold the luxury SUV she adored, liquidated an investment account, and moved out of the house she once treated as her kingdom. Not because I demanded revenge, but because facts do what anger never can. They stand. Daniel filed for separation 3 months later. I never urged it. I never had to. Some betrayals end marriages on their own. And the greatest irony was this. The woman who said I was too embarrassing for Easter became the one no one wanted seated at their table. But my victory was never simply her downfall. It was what I reclaimed. During the legal review of family assets, Daniel discovered his late father had placed the farmhouse and surrounding acreage in a trust, naming me sole controller for life, with succession protections Vanessa had never known existed. She had spent years acting as if I was living on borrowed grace, when in truth she had been living under my roof. I transferred part of the property into Chloe's name and established a scholarship fund in my husband's memory using money recovered in the settlement. Then I rewrote my estate entirely. No longer from guilt, from clarity. I kept the house. I kept my dignity. And I took back every inch of authority she had tried to strip from me. A week before that Easter, Daniel stood in my kitchen, tears in his eyes, asking how I could forgive him. I told him forgiveness is not forgetting. It is deciding pain will not remain in charge. Then I handed him a place card and said, "Set the table." And he did. That afternoon, after dessert, Chloe raised a glass and said, "Grandma taught us that truth may arrive late, but it always arrives dressed for dinner." Everyone laughed, but I felt something deeper settle in me. Peace, perhaps. Or justice. Before sunset, a delivery truck arrived with a package forwarded by mistake from Vanessa's old address. Inside was a silver Easter serving tray she had once mocked as outdated, the one my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary. Tucked beneath it was a note in her handwriting.
No apology.
Just one line. I underestimated you. I folded the note, placed it in the fire, and watched it turn to ash. Because some endings do not need reconciliation. They need finality. When the grandchildren hunted eggs in the orchard and church bells rang across the valley, I looked around my table and realized something Vanessa never understood. Family is not controlled by whoever speaks the loudest, manipulates the most, or performs best in public. Family belongs to the one who keeps truth alive when others would bury it. She tried to exile me from Easter. Instead, she gave me back my house, my son, my standing, and a stronger family than the one she tried to poison. And every Easter since, there's been one empty seat no one mentions. Not out of bitterness. Out of consequence. Because some lies cost reputations. Some cost fortunes. Hers cost everything. And mine, in the end, gained more than I had lost. You embarrass us, Eleanor. I can't have you saying odd things in front of Daniel's colleagues at Easter dinner, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said as she adjusted the silver napkin rings I had polished with my own hands. She did not whisper it. She said it in my kitchen, in the warm afternoon light, beside the glazed ham I had basted since dawn, as if she were commenting on the weather. For a moment, I thought I had heard her wrong. At 68, your hearing betrays you now and then, but not your dignity. I stood very still, one hand resting on the china platter my late husband had bought me for our 25th anniversary, and listened for my son to correct her. Daniel said nothing. That silence cut deeper than her words. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked so loudly it seemed to mark the death of something old and sacred. Easter had always belonged to me. For 37 years, I had set this table. Dyed eggs with the grandchildren. Baked hot cross buns before sunrise. Folded linen napkins in little rabbit ears when the children were small. My home had been the place where family returned. Yet Vanessa stood there, in a pale yellow dress too expensive for an ordinary Sunday, telling me I was now an embarrassment to my own tradition. I smiled, though my throat felt tight. That surprised her. I think she expected tears. Or pleading. But age teaches a woman there are moments when silence carries more force than protest. She continued, softer now, almost rehearsed. She said Daniel's clients would be attending, important people from the firm, and my stories about the old neighborhood and my husband's hardware store might seem provincial. Provincial. I had not heard that word used against a person in 40 years. I looked toward Daniel. His eyes stayed on the floorboards. There are betrayals that arrive as explosions. Others come dressed in politeness. Those are colder. Then I won't trouble your Easter, I said. Vanessa gave a relieved little exhale, already believing she had won. But before she could gather her purse, I added, perhaps I'll host my own. Her smile faltered. Just for a second. Enough for me to notice. Enough to know I had unsettled something. After they left, I stood in the kitchen alone with the lamb roast cooling on the counter. Sunlight shifted across the tablecloth I had ironed that morning. 6 places set. 6 untouched water glasses catching light. I should have cleared the table. Instead, I sat down at my husband's old chair and ran my finger along the carved wood armrest. Harold used to say truth reveals itself around a dinner table because people show you who they are when they believe they're entitled. I did not understand then how right he was. The phone rang at dusk. It was Chloe, my granddaughter. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Mom told everyone you decided not to come because you've been confused lately. Confused. There it was. Not exclusion. Erasure. I felt something inside me turn cold and clear. Not rage. Resolve. I looked at the Easter lilies on the windowsill, then at the guest list I had started weeks before, and for the first time all day, I smiled for real. Because Vanessa had made one mistake women like her always make. She thought humiliation would make me disappear. She had no idea she had just given me a reason to set a much larger table. The next morning I did not call Daniel. I did not defend myself to cousins or explain anything to the women from church who had begun texting polite questions about Easter plans. I made coffee in the blue stoneware mug Harold used every morning for 30 years and sat at the kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the window over the sink. There is a kind of pain that arrives loud, but this was quieter than grief. It moved through ordinary things. The extra place setting still. Stacked on the buffet. The ham wrapped in foil inside the refrigerator. A basket of pastel eggs waiting for children who had not come. I opened the old cedar chest in the hallway where I kept holiday linens and found the hand-embroidered runner my mother had sewn before I was married. Tiny rabbits stitched in fading thread. I held it in my lap longer than necessary. Memory can be a comfort until it begins rearranging itself into evidence. And that morning, memories came differently. Not as nostalgia. As pattern. The Christmas Vanessa insisted it would be easier if gifts were opened at her house before I arrived. The Thanksgiving she changed dinner by 3 hours and somehow forgot to tell me. The grandson's school concert where my seat had mysteriously been reassigned to the back row. At the time I had called these misunderstandings. Women raised in my generation often rename cruelty, so we can survive it. But sitting there with rain on the windows and cold coffee beside me, I began to see a design beneath what I had dismissed for years. Chloe came over around noon with a paper sack of lemon scones from the bakery near campus. She stood in the doorway uncertain, as though entering a house after bad news. I kissed her cheek and told her to come in before the scones got stale. We ate in silence for a while. Then she said, almost casually, "Mom has been telling people you get confused with dates now." She did not look at me when she said it. She stared at the sugar bowl. I asked how long she had heard this. She hesitated. A while. There are answers that bruise more because they arrive gently. I nodded as if discussing the weather. Then I asked who had been invited to Vanessa's Easter. Chloe listed names. Daniel's law partners. The Whitmore cousins. 2 families from their country club. And then she mentioned something strange. A fundraising pitch Vanessa planned to make after dinner for a nonprofit board she wanted to join. I looked up. She turned Easter into networking? Chloe gave a sad little smile. Grandma, everything is networking for my mother. We both laughed, but there was sorrow inside it. After she left, I walked through the house room by room. Not aimlessly. Assessing. The dining room could seat 16 if I opened the extension leaves. The back garden could hold folding tables under the dogwoods if the weather stayed clear. The church ladies would help if I asked. Mrs. Parker still owed me a favor from the hospital fundraiser. By evening I had a legal pad covered in names. Cousins Vanessa had stopped inviting. Old neighbors Daniel had drifted from. Harold's former business partner and his wife. Not a replacement dinner. Something larger. Something true. As twilight settled, I found myself at Harold's desk opening the recipe box where I kept family cards and old correspondence. A folded note slipped loose from between the divinity fudge recipe and cornbread dressing. Harold's handwriting. I had forgotten it was there. One line, written years ago after some minor family squabble I no longer remembered. Never surrender the table, Ellie. It is where truth comes to sit. I read it 3 times. Then I picked up the phone and began making calls. By Thursday, the invitations had begun traveling farther than I expected. Not printed cards with gold edges and formal script, but quiet calls, handwritten notes, and conversations passed from one old friend to another the way real gatherings used to be built. I called it a Resurrection Sunday supper. Not because I wished to make a point, though perhaps some part of me did, but because resurrection felt like the right word for something I had nearly allowed to die. By noon, Mrs. Parker had offered silver chafing dishes from the church fellowship hall. My cousin Lorraine said she would bring deviled eggs and the coconut cake everyone pretended not to fight over. Even Harold's old partner, Walter Green, whom I had not seen in 6 years, said he would come if I saved him a seat near the bourbon pecan pie. The house, which had felt hollow 2 days earlier, began to breathe again. Yet what unsettled me was not who accepted. It was who called with confusion. My nephew Raymond asked why Vanessa had told him I had gone to stay with relatives because my memory was worsening. I stood at the kitchen phone with the receiver pressed to my ear and felt the room tilt. Another cousin, mentioned Vanessa, had hinted I might be considering assisted living. Little suggestions. Casual poison. Not dramatic enough to sound malicious. Just enough to weaken how others saw me. I wrote each remark down on a yellow legal pad, though I did not yet know why. Some instinct told me details matter when truth has been dressed in polite lies. That evening Chloe arrived carrying 2 banker boxes from Daniel's garage. I found these when Mom asked me to drop off old tax folders for shredding, she said. Something felt wrong. We opened them on the dining room floor. Receipts. Donation ledgers. Committee brochures. At first it looked like ordinary paperwork from Vanessa's charity work. Then Chloe pulled out a folder marked Scholarship Trust. I almost set it aside, assuming it belonged to one of the children's college accounts. But inside were statements showing withdrawals I did not understand. Transfers authorized with Daniel's digital signature. Amounts too large to ignore. I read the numbers once, then again. 20,000. 12,000. 8,000. Did Uncle Daniel know? Chloe whispered. I did not answer because I did not know. But I recognized something else. Some of those funds had been pledged publicly at events Vanessa hosted. Donations she claimed came from her own generosity. I sat back on the rug and looked at the papers spread around us like puzzle pieces. The Easter insult had not been about embarrassment. It had been about control. People who build false reputations fear witnesses more than critics. Chloe broke the silence. Grandma, what are you going to do? I folded the statements neatly and placed them back in the folder.
Serve dinner, I said.
She stared, then laughed despite herself. But that night, after she left, I called Walter Green. He had once been an accountant before Harold lured him into hardware stores. I asked if he would look at some documents before Sunday. There was a pause, then he said, Ellie, bring coffee, and I will bring a calculator. The next afternoon, I drove to his lake house with the folder on the passenger seat. We spent 3 hours at his kitchen table while geese moved over the water outside. He circled. Entries in red ink. Duplicate reimbursements. Misclassified charitable disbursements. Missing trust notices. When he finally leaned back, he removed his glasses and said quietly, This is not social climbing, Eleanor. This is exposure waiting for a witness. On the drive home, I passed Daniel's neighborhood and slowed outside his brick colonial. Vanessa's tulips lined the walkway in perfect rows. Her porch lanterns glowed as if nothing in that house had ever been false. I could have driven up,
Confronted them.
demanded answers. Instead, I kept driving. Some truths are wasted in private arguments. They need an audience. And as I turned into my own driveway and saw lights glowing warm through my kitchen window, I realized Easter dinner was no longer merely a gathering I intended to reclaim. It was becoming a reckoning. Saturday arrived with a bright cold wind that rattled the budding dogwoods and carried the smell of turned earth through the screen door. By 7 a.m, my kitchen had become a kind of command post. Hams warming in the oven, casserole dishes arriving wrapped in towels, handwritten place cards drying near the window. It had been years since I had cooked for more than a handful, yet my hands remembered what grief had almost made me forget. Movement can steady a wounded heart. As I arranged china across the extended dining table, I noticed I had set 18 places, though I had invited 16. I left the extra 2. Harold used to say unexpected guests often bring the truth. Around 10, Chloe rushed in carrying tulips and breathless news. Vanessa had found out. She called Aunt Lorraine asking why everyone was going to your house. Chloe said, setting flowers in a crystal pitcher. And she sounded furious. I pressed the stems into water and said only, good. But inwardly, I felt the first tremor of what was coming. By noon, Walter arrived in a tweed jacket with the marked-up statements tucked inside a leather portfolio. He did not mention them immediately. Instead, he helped move folding chairs to the garden and tasted the bourbon glaze as if this were an ordinary holiday.
There was wisdom in that.
Let truth sit beside normal life before unveiling itself. Guests began arriving at 1. Cousins who had not spoken in years embraced in the foyer. Church ladies filled the living room with perfume and laughter. Daniel's old college friend Mark showed up unexpectedly after hearing through Raymond. Even the pastor from our old congregation came carrying lemon bars. I watched from the doorway as people mingled beneath the budding trees, and something inside me softened. Vanessa had meant to isolate me, and instead she had gathered my people back together. Yet beneath the warmth, tension moved quietly. Questions floated. Why had there been 2 Easter dinners? Why had Eleanor been absent from family holidays lately? I answered none of them. Let curiosity ripen. Around 2:30, Daniel arrived alone. I saw his sedan pull into the gravel drive and felt my pulse quicken. He stepped out in shirt sleeves, looking tired in a way success does not explain. For a moment, he stood beside the car, as though uncertain whether he belonged. Then he walked toward me. Mother, he said, and that old word, not mom but mother, nearly undid me. He looked around at the crowd and seemed startled. I did not know all these people were coming. Neither did I said. He gave a strained smile. We stood in silence until he asked, too carefully, Did Vanessa tell you she might stop by? There it was. I looked at him. Should she be worried? His face changed. A son can hide from his mother for years, but not in one question. Before he answered, a black SUV turned into the drive. Vanessa. She stepped out in cream heels unsuited for gravel, wearing the composed smile women wear when they intend to regain control. Conversation in the yard thinned almost at once. She moved toward us carrying a hostess gift, as though this were a social call. Eleanor, she said sweetly, kissing air near my cheek, I heard you decided to do something spontaneous. Spontaneous. As if decades of tradition had merely become a whim. I accepted the gift box and placed it unopened on a side table. You are just in time for Grace, I said. During dinner, she played her part beautifully. Complimented the lamb. Asked after the pastor's wife. Mentioned her charity. Board nomination twice. But performance phrase under scrutiny. At dessert, Walter rose unexpectedly and tapped his spoon against a glass. Before pie, he said, Eleanor has something to share. Every sound in the room seemed to withdraw. Vanessa set down her fork. Daniel looked at me, confused. I stood, one hand resting on Harold's chair, and lifted the yellow legal pad where I had written every lie that arrived disguised as concern. Then I reached for Walter's portfolio. In that moment, I saw Vanessa understand, not fully, but enough. The smile left her face. And for the first time since she had called me embarrassing, she looked afraid. For one suspended second, no one moved. The china, the candlelight, the spring flowers, even the laughter that had floated so easily all afternoon seemed to pause with me. I looked around the table and began not with accusation, but with a story. I spoke about Easter's past, about Harold hiding eggs for Daniel under the dogwoods, about years when our family gathered without calculation. Then I said quietly, lately I have been told I am forgetful, confused, too embarrassing to sit at my own family table. A murmur stirred. Vanessa opened her mouth as if to interrupt, but Walter laid one hand over the portfolio and waited. I read from the yellow pad. Each remark others had repeated to me. Each rumor passed as concern. Assisted living. Memory loss. Instability. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Calm truth carries farther than outrage. Vanessa laughed lightly and said, Eleanor, this is a misunderstanding. People exaggerate. But before the charm in her tone could settle, Chloe spoke. I heard you say it, Mom. Her voice trembled, yet she did not look away. That was the first crack. The second came when Walter opened the folder. He handed Daniel the scholarship trust statements without ceremony. I watched my son's eyes move across the numbers, then stop. He read again, more slowly. What is this? He asked. Vanessa reached for the papers, smiling too quickly. Board reimbursements. Administrative transfers. You would not understand the nonprofit structure. Walter cleared his throat. I understand accounting. Then he named the duplicated reimbursements, the redirected donor funds, the withdrawals from Chloe's trust. Each item simple, precise, devastating. Around the table faces changed. The pastor lowered his fork. Lorraine covered her mouth. Mark leaned back as though distance might help him process what he was hearing. Vanessa's composure began to fray in tiny ways first. A hand smoothing her dress too often. A swallow she could not hide. Then came the mistake women like her make when cornered. She grew indignant. This is absurd. Eleanor has always resented how Daniel and I built our life. There it was. Not denial. Contempt. Daniel looked at her as if seeing a stranger seated beside him. Did you use Chloe's trust? He asked. She did not answer directly. Instead, she spoke about temporary reallocations and cash flow. But truth has a cruel simplicity. A yes disguised as explanation is still a yes. Chloe stood up, so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. You took my tuition money? Silence followed, harder than shouting. Vanessa turned toward me then, anger burning through the polish. You planned this. I met her gaze.
No, Vanessa.
You planned this. I only invited witnesses. Walter then produced one final sheet. A copy of a pledge letter Vanessa had signed using family assets she did not control to leverage her charity board nomination. That changed everything. This was no longer family cruelty exposed at dessert. It carried legal consequence. I saw it register in the room. Vanessa saw it too. Her face lost color. She pushed back from the table and whispered to Daniel that they should leave. But Daniel did not rise. He remained seated, staring at the papers, then at me. "Mother," he said hoarsely, "why did you not tell me sooner?" I thought of every holiday I had swallowed hurt to keep peace. "Because you were not ready to hear it." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he turned to Vanessa and said words so quiet half the table leaned in to catch them. "Do not speak for me again." The old authority in her posture collapsed. No dramatic scene followed. No overturned table.
No screaming.
Only something far more final. Reputation slipping in real time. Before anyone touched. The pie, Mrs. Parker, who chaired the Women's Hospital Foundation, asked in a level voice whether Vanessa's board nomination involved the same funds under question. Vanessa could not answer. And in that silence, with every eye upon her and nowhere left to perform, I understood the reckoning had only begun. No one ate dessert after that. The pies sat untouched while conversation fractured into stunned whispers across the dining room, but I remained standing, one hand still resting on Harold's chair as though some part of him steadied me. Vanessa gathered herself enough to leave with dignity, or what she hoped might resemble it. She reached for her handbag and said she would have her attorney review these malicious insinuations. Walter gave a small smile only an old accountant could make look dangerous.
"Please do," he said.
Daniel rose at last, but instead of following her, he asked for the folder. He took it to my study and closed the door behind him. For nearly an hour guests lingered awkwardly, pretending to sip coffee, while waiting for the shape of the family to reveal itself. I moved among them refilling cups, slicing coconut cake no one touched, doing the ordinary things women do when extraordinary things threaten to split a room apart. That, too, is a form of control. Before leaving, Mrs. Parker pulled me aside near the butler's pantry. "The foundation board meets Tuesday," she said quietly. "Those documents change certain assumptions." It was not gossip. It was consequence in polite clothes. After sunset, Daniel emerged from the study, looking 10 years older. He did not speak until the last guest had gone and Chloe had loaded dishes into the sink. Then he asked if we could walk outside. We crossed the back lawn where Easter eggs still hid under the dogwoods, forgotten by children distracted by adult collapse. For a while he said nothing. Then, how much of this did Father know? I looked at the darkening orchard. Enough to protect what mattered. He frowned. "What does that mean?" I told him about the family trust Harold established years before, naming me controlling trustee over the farmhouse and reserve assets until my death. Daniel stopped walking. Vanessa thought the house would pass directly through me. "I know," I said. His silence was almost a confession. Then came another blow I had not expected. He admitted Vanessa had pressured him for months to persuade me to downsize, sell the property, and fold proceeds into investment ventures she managed. The Easter insult had not been mere cruelty. It had been stage 1 of removal. I felt cold despite the spring air. Some betrayals grow larger the more light touches them. The next morning Daniel called before 8. He had confronted Vanessa overnight. She insisted the trust withdrawals were temporary and accused me of orchestrating humiliation out of jealousy. But Daniel, for once, had asked for original statements rather than explanations. He found additional transfers. Personal expenses routed through non-profit reimbursements. Membership dues paid from donor funds. By noon he had frozen joint discretionary accounts pending review. That afternoon word began moving faster than I could have imagined. Mark called to say one of Daniel's partners had quietly withdrawn from supporting Vanessa's board nomination. Mrs. Parker sent a note that the foundation had requested formal documentation before considering any appointment. And just before dinner, Chloe arrived flushed from campus. "Grandma, Mom is furious. She says people are judging her based on appearances." I almost laughed. Appearances. The very altar she had worshipped had become her trial. Yet what unsettled me most came after dark when Walter telephoned. He had looked deeper into one flagged reimbursement and discovered pledged funds had been used to secure a bridge loan against a development project tied to a consultant group Vanessa advised. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "this may be larger than family misconduct." I sat at Harold's desk long after the call ended, fingers resting on the old recipe box where his notes still lay. Never surrender the table. It was no longer only about lies told to shame an old woman at Easter. It was moving toward financial exposure with legal shadows I had never intended to summon. And still, beneath the gravity of it, I felt no triumph. Only a severe clarity. Because once truth enters a house, it does not politely leave after dessert. It keeps opening doors. 3 days later, a courier delivered a certified envelope addressed to Daniel. He brought it unopened to my kitchen. We stood together while rain tapped the windows just as it had the morning I first understood the pattern. He broke the seal, read 2 lines, and went pale. Then he handed me the letter. It was a notice of inquiry from the State Charity Commission requesting records tied to Vanessa's fundraising activities. I looked up at my son. He whispered, almost to himself, "My God, what else have I not seen?" And in that moment, I realized the reckoning had moved beyond my table into a world Vanessa could not charm. The inquiry letter changed the rhythm of everything. Until then, the betrayal had still lived partly inside family wounds, wrapped in old hurts and whispered humiliations. But once state regulators entered the picture, silence took on a different weight. Daniel spent 2 days at his office pulling records, meeting with counsel, avoiding my calls until late Wednesday night when he appeared at my door looking hollow-eyed and rain-soaked. He carried no briefcase, only a grocery sack with takeout soup he forgot to remove from the counter. "I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere," he said. We sat at the kitchen table, where so much had already been unearthed. He told me investigators had traced several pledged donations routed through a consulting entity Vanessa partially owned, but never disclosed to the foundation. There were compliance questions, potential civil penalties, review hearings. He spoke like a lawyer trying to turn catastrophe into vocabulary. I listened as a mother watching a son reckon with the architecture of deception he had mistaken for marriage. "Did you know?" I asked. His answer came slowly. "I knew she pushed boundaries. I did not know she moved money." There is a difference between ignorance and refusal to see. He was only beginning to understand it. The next morning the town moved as towns do, faster than facts but slower than shame. At the bakery, 2 women stopped talking when I entered. At the pharmacy, Mrs. Donnelly squeezed my arm and said, "Hold steady, Eleanor." Even sympathy carries news inside it. Chloe called from campus to say her mother had withdrawn from the charity board nomination before the board could formally remove her. A tactical retreat. But appearances had started cracking in places Vanessa could not manage. Then Friday brought the second blow. Walter drove over without calling, which meant urgency. He set a folded newspaper on my table and tapped a small business section item. A development partnership tied to Vanessa's consultant group had suspended operations pending financial review. "Leverage loans unravel quickly when trust evaporates," he said. I poured coffee with surprisingly steady hands. "Will she be charged?" He shrugged. "That depends on intent and restitution. But reputations are already charging interest." Yet the moment that stayed with me came that evening when Daniel invited me to meet him at the farmhouse office where Harold once kept ledgers. He had been searching trust files and found a sealed envelope from my husband's estate attorney. We opened it together. Inside were updated trust instructions and a memorandum Harold wrote after one bitter holiday years ago when Vanessa first suggested selling the property. He had anticipated pressure, anticipated manipulation. The memorandum affirmed sole control of the farmhouse and reserve land rested with me, not Daniel, until I chose otherwise. More startling still, Harold included a protective clause removing indirect spouses from succession benefit if found to have influenced coercive transfer attempts. Daniel read the line twice, then looked up as though seeing his father alive in a room. "She never knew this existed," he whispered. "Neither had I. Sometimes the dead continue protecting us in paperwork." On Sunday, Vanessa called for the first time since Easter. Her voice carried no sweetness now, only brittle exhaustion. She asked to meet privately. I declined. Anything that concerns family can be said with witnesses, I told her. There was a long silence before she asked if I had turned Daniel against her. I almost pitied her then. Even at the edge of collapse, she imagined influence. Worked only through manipulation. No, I said. Truth did that. She hung up without goodbye. 2 days later, Daniel moved into the guest apartment above his office. Separation, he called it, as if naming pain carefully might reduce it. Chloe cried in my kitchen while I rolled pie crust. Life insists on ordinary tasks, even during moral earthquakes. Then, just when I thought the shape of consequences had settled, a certified notice arrived from Vanessa's attorneys proposing restitution negotiations regarding the trust withdrawals. Restitution. The word itself was confession wearing legal tailoring. Daniel read it, sat very still, and finally said, "She wants to pay back what she took before charges move forward." I looked out toward the orchard where late blossoms were beginning to fall. Weeks earlier, I had only wanted back my place at Easter. Now the woman who called me an embarrassment was negotiating repayment to avoid public prosecution. Yet I sensed one revelation still waited. Because Harold's memorandum referenced an older deed attachment missing from the trust packet. Walter noticed it too. He tapped the absent exhibit number and said, almost casually, "Ellie, if that attachment says what I think it says, Vanessa has misunderstood who owns far more than a dinner table." Walter found the missing deed attachment 3 days later in a records archive 2 counties over, folded inside an old property transfer packet no one had opened in years. He brought a certified copy to my kitchen in a manila envelope worn soft at the edges, as if even paper understood the weight it carried. I made coffee while he laid it flat beneath the morning light. The farmhouse, the orchard, the adjoining 12 acres Harold had quietly purchased decades ago, even the lake cottage Daniel believed had been absorbed into marital holdings, had all been placed under a family preservation deed governed by me as life steward. There was a clause, old-fashioned and ironclad, barring forced sale, collateral leverage, or spousal derivative claim, without my written consent. I read it once, then again, and sat back in stunned silence. Vanessa had spent years maneuvering toward assets she had never been entitled to touch. Walter smiled without triumph. Sometimes justice is filed at the county clerk. That afternoon Daniel arrived, and I watched realization move through him in waves. First disbelief, then humiliation, then something sterner. "She's been discussing refinancing this property for over a year," he said quietly. "She said once you moved to assisted living we could modernize everything." There it was again. Not misunderstanding. Design. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then Daniel did something he had not done in years. He apologized without defending himself. Not for a single argument or omission, but for abandoning discernment. There is a kind of sorrow mothers prepare for, and a kind that still catches breath. I touched his hand and said only, "See clearly now." The next week restitution negotiations became formal. Vanessa's attorneys proposed immediate repayment of the trust withdrawals plus penalties in exchange for cooperation with regulators. But what changed the balance was the deed. Once her counsel learned no marital claim existed against the preserved properties, the tone shifted overnight. Her leverage evaporated. The woman who once treated me as disposable now sent intermediaries asking for a private family resolution. I declined again. Truth had reached the point where privacy served only the deceiver. Then came the hearing at the Charity Commission. I did not attend, but Mrs. Parker telephoned afterward. Vanessa had resigned all board roles. Her public censure would not be dramatic, she said, but permanent. Donor circles have long memories. 2 consulting clients suspended contracts the same week. The development venture dissolved. Financially, the unraveling had begun. Yet it was Chloe who delivered the sharpest human reckoning. She moved out of her parents' house and into a small apartment near campus using funds Daniel restored from the trust. "I need distance from performance," she told me while we unpacked dishes from a thrift store box. Such a young sentence to hold so much age. One rainy Thursday, Vanessa arrived unannounced at my door.
no silk blouse, no composed smile, no audience.
Just a woman who looked tired. In the plainest way, she asked if we could speak. I let her sit at the kitchen table, but did not pour coffee. She said the transfers had been temporary decisions made under pressure. She said social expectations had become expensive. She said she had only wanted security. I listened until she finally asked, almost inaudibly, "Did you plan all of this from the beginning?" I looked at the same table where she once called me embarrassing and felt something almost like pity pass through me. "No," I said. "I planned Easter dinner." She began to cry then, not theatrically, but with the stunned grief of someone meeting consequence without costume. When she left, she forgot her gloves on the chair. I never mailed them back. 2 weeks later, Daniel brought final settlement papers for my review. Full restitution funded by liquidated assets, resignation acknowledgments, and separate council notices confirming marital separation proceedings had begun. But tucked in the packet was one additional page Daniel had added himself. A transfer deed granting Chloe a future remainder interest in the orchard, preserving it through another generation. "I thought grandfather would approve," he said. I signed with a hand steadier than I expected. The woman once deemed too embarrassing for Easter now controlled every asset Vanessa had quietly pursued, had seen the stolen money restored, had watched the architect of her humiliation lose status, contracts, and influence. Yet even then I sensed one final reckoning remained, not in courtrooms or bank ledgers, but in the social world Vanessa had valued above blood. That came sooner than expected when a cream envelope arrived embossed with a hospital foundation seal. Inside was an invitation addressed to me alone, requesting I chair the spring legacy gala Vanessa once hoped would launch her into prominence. At the bottom, Mrs. Parker had written by hand, "Bring the silver Easter tray. There may be toasts." The hospital legacy gala was held in early May at the old Westbrook Conservatory, a limestone building where Vanessa had once posed for charity photographs in gowns too elegant for ordinary mercy. I wore navy silk Harold liked, the same pearls I had nearly stopped wearing after he died, and carried the silver Easter tray Mrs. Parker had jokingly requested. But nothing about that evening was a joke. When I entered the ballroom, people turned not with pity, but with recognition. Women who had once politely endured Vanessa now crossed the room to take my hand. Men Daniel grew up around nodded with a kind of quiet respect I had not felt in years. There is a difference between sympathy and restored standing. I felt the latter before I sat down. Mrs. Parker placed me at the head table beside the hospital president. Across the room, I noticed one empty chair where Vanessa's name would have appeared had life followed her intended script. It had been removed from the seating chart. Small acts can carry the force of verdicts. During dinner, Daniel leaned toward me and whispered that Vanessa had finalized the liquidation of her investment account to satisfy the restitution agreement. "She is moving into a condo downtown," he said. I nodded, though what struck me was not her reduced circumstances, but how ordinary consequence can look from a distance.
No Sander.
Just invoices. Then came the toasts. After the president spoke about legacy giving, Mrs. Parker rose unexpectedly and said there was one more acknowledgement. She told the room about an anonymous donor restoring a student nursing scholarship once endangered by financial irregularities. Then she looked at me. "That donor is Eleanor Whitmore, using funds recovered through remarkable integrity." Applause rose, first polite, then warm, then prolonged enough to unsettle me. I stood only because sitting felt impossible. But the true turn came after dessert when a woman I barely knew approached from another table. She introduced herself as counsel to the foundation and quietly informed me the regulatory inquiry had concluded that afternoon. Civil penalties had been assessed, Vanessa's charitable credentials formally suspended pending review, and because restitution was made before escalation, criminal referral was avoided. Avoided? The word held mercy I had not requested. Yet even in spared prosecution, the public finding remained. Financial penalty, professional, censure, social exile, clear consequences in every sphere that had mattered to her. I stepped into the conservatory garden for air and found Daniel there under string lights among blooming roses. He looked lighter somehow. "Mother," he said, I have done something I should have done years ago. He handed me a folder. Inside was a revised estate plan naming me irrevocable co-trust protector and affirming the orchard transfer to Chloe. Below it, a personal letter. In it he wrote he would never again allow silence to substitute for loyalty. I folded it carefully. Some apologies arrive too late. Others arrive exactly when they can still heal. When we returned inside, Mrs. Parker asked me to use the silver tray for the ceremonial pledge cards. As I passed it through the room, I thought of Vanessa mocking old family things as provincial. Now, the very tray she dismissed had become part of an evening honoring me. There was symmetry in that almost too perfect to script. Near the end of the gala, a volunteer handed me a forwarded envelope left at registration. No return address. Inside was a single note in Vanessa's hand. I was wrong about who should have been ashamed.
No plea.
No defense. Only that. I placed it back in the envelope and slipped it into my purse. Some confessions do not need witnesses. Driving home, Daniel asked whether I felt victorious. I looked out at streetlights passing over the windshield and considered the word. Victory sounded too sharp. No, I said. Restored. A week later, the foundation announced I would chair next year's gala. Chloe moved into the lake cottage for summer. Daniel began divorce mediation with surprising calm. And on a bright Sunday morning, standing in the orchard with blossoms falling like pale confetti, I realized every structure Vanessa tried to leverage now stood more securely under my hand than before she attacked it. She had lost contracts, reputation, access to family assets, and the social throne she valued. I had regained my son, preserved the estate, restored stolen funds, and taken public honor from the very circles she once used to diminish me. Yet one final piece remained unsettled. The farmhouse deed transfer office. Called to say an old filing error regarding Harold's adjacent mineral rights parcel required my signature to correct. Walter laughed when he heard. Ellie, he said, if those rights are what I think they are, your daughter-in-law did not just misjudge a dinner table. She misjudged a fortune. The mineral rights parcel turned out not to be oil or some dramatic fortune from an old frontier tale, but something quieter and in its own way more powerful. Beneath the adjacent acreage Harold purchased years before lay a long-term limestone extraction royalty agreement, modest for decades, newly renegotiated because of regional development. Walter spread the revised valuation across my kitchen table and removed his glasses the way he always did before delivering news meant to settle heavily. Ellie, he said, this trust is worth far more than Vanessa ever imagined. Not millions that change people into caricatures, but enough to end uncertainty for generations if managed well. The irony nearly made me laugh. She had spent years maneuvering for control of assets she misunderstood, while overlooking the quiet value hidden in the land she called outdated. Daniel stared at the figures and leaned back in disbelief. She wanted to sell this place for a modern build, he said softly. She nearly pushed us to surrender what father preserved. But something in him had changed beyond regret now. There was steel where passivity had lived. The next week he asked me to accompany him to the final mediation session, not as litigant, but as witness. I hesitated, then agreed. We met in a panel conference room downtown where the air smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. Vanessa sat at one end in a cream suit I recognized from happier, more performative seasons. For a moment, I saw not an enemy, but a woman exhausted by the collapse of an identity built too carefully. Yet consequence remained consequence. Her counsel reviewed terms. Restitution completed. Separate property claims waived. No interest in the preserved trust holdings acknowledged. Daniel retained the right to seek indemnification should additional regulatory liabilities emerge. Legal phrases can sound bloodless, but each one was a gate closing. Then came the moment I did not expect. Vanessa asked if she might speak privately before signing. Her attorney objected. Daniel nodded yes. We stepped into a side room with only fluorescent lights and a long, empty table between us. She looked at me for a long time before saying, I thought if I controlled appearances, I controlled outcomes. I said nothing. She continued, voice thin now. I called you embarrassing because I was afraid people respected you more than they ever respected me. There are admissions that feel less like apology than surrender. She slid a document across the table. It was a formal renunciation of any future advisory role over Chloe's educational or inheritance structures, voluntarily executed. She should trust someone, Vanessa said, and it is not me. I signed as acknowledging party. When we returned to the main room, Daniel executed the final separation agreement. Vanessa signed last. Her hand shook only once. No one spoke dramatically.
No door slammed.
Yet when those papers were collected, an entire era ended more decisively than any courtroom spectacle could have managed. Outside the courthouse, Daniel stood beside me on the steps and exhaled as if surfacing from underwater. I kept thinking power was in keeping peace, he said. You showed me power can be in drawing a line. We drove home through spring rain, and for the first time in years he asked whether I would consider moving him back into the farmhouse guest wing while he rebuilt. I smiled and told him there was room if he learned to prune roses. He moved in the following month. Chloe spent weekends at the lake cottage studying on the porch. The royalty income was placed into a preservation trust and scholarship expansion under joint stewardship. I did not simply regain control. I restructured the future. Then came one final social reckoning no lawyer could script. At the next hospital gala, as incoming chair, I announced a new Whitmore Legacy Fund financed partly through recovered assets and partly through the newly disclosed land royalties. The room rose in applause. Mrs. Parker leaned over and whispered, "Your daughter-in-law tried to keep you from Easter dinner. Now they are naming programs after you." But what completed it came a week later when the country club Vanessa once treated as her stage quietly revoked honorary committee privileges tied to lap standing. Not public humiliation. Worse for her. Social disappearance.
Contracts gone. Board roles gone.
Access to family wealth gone. Marriage gone. Her penalties had become financial, reputational, and legal in everything but criminal filing. And mine had become something larger than vindication.
Authority.
Yet one unfinished matter remained in Harold's old desk. Among estate papers, Daniel found a sealed letter marked to be opened if family trust is threatened. We placed it on the table between us unopened until Sunday supper. As candlelight touched the envelope, Daniel looked at me and said, almost smiling, "Whatever father left in there, I suspect Vanessa would have hated it most." We opened Harold's letter after Sunday supper while rain moved softly against the porch screens and the scent of roast chicken still lingered in the dining room. Daniel slit the envelope with my old silver letter opener and unfolded 3 pages written in Harold's careful block script. I expected sentiment. Instead, it was strategy from a man who had seen farther than either of us knew. He wrote that families are rarely broken by greed all at once, but by the slow surrender of boundaries disguised as harmony. Then came the clause Daniel had guessed Vanessa would have hated. Harold directed that if the family trust were ever threatened by coercion or manipulation, the controlling steward, meaning me, was authorized to reallocate up to 1/3 of trust appreciation into a matrilineal preservation branch for descendants demonstrating loyalty to family stewardship. Daniel looked up halfway through and laughed in disbelief. Father created an escape hatch. In practical terms, it meant I could formalize what we had already begun with Chloe and expand the scholarship and preservation trust beyond anything Vanessa had anticipated. But at the bottom, Harold had added one handwritten line apart from the legal instructions. If anyone ever tries to remove your place at the table, make the table larger and leave them to explain why they are absent. I had to set the letter down. Some wisdom arrives after death exactly when it is needed. Within a month, the Whitmore Legacy Fund was formally established. Chloe joined as junior trustee. Daniel contributed a percentage of his annual distributions. The royalty income funded rural nursing scholarships and orchard preservation easements. Reporters from a regional paper even ran a small feature on legacy philanthropy and family land stewardship. My name appeared not as a widow to be pitted, but as founder. I clipped the article and tucked it beside Harold's note. Meanwhile, consequences continued settling over Vanessa, not with drama, but permanence. The state inquiry closed with civil findings publicly posted in nonprofit registries. Her consulting license was not revoked, but disclosures now followed her professional filings. 2 social committees quietly replaced her. Invitations thinned. Friends once drawn to status drifted when status no longer paid dividends. She was not destroyed. She was diminished by truth. There is a difference, and I had no appetite for more than justice required. One afternoon, she asked to meet at a coffee shop halfway between town and the lake. I almost declined, then went. She looked smaller somehow, without the scaffolding of performance. She slid a check across the table. Final accrued interest from the restitution calculation, paid in full. I wanted there to be nothing left owed, she said. I studied her for a moment and realized I no longer felt wounded in her presence. Only distance. Before leaving, she said, "You took everything back." I surprised myself by answering, "No. I kept what was mine." She nodded as if that distinction finally mattered. When she left, she did not look back. That evening, Daniel helped me hang lanterns in the orchard for Chloe's graduation dinner. Family gathered under the same dogwoods where Easter had become reckoning. Cousins who once heard lies about my confusion toasted Chloe's honors. Mrs. Parker brought the coconut cake again. Walter, after too much bourbon, announced that Harold had probably planned half this from heaven. Laughter rolled through the trees. At dessert, Daniel rose with a small velvet box. Inside was a key Harold had kept for a cedar cabinet in the farmhouse study. "I think it belongs to the matriarch," he said. It was theatrical in the sweetest way. Yet what moved me most came later after everyone left. Daniel paused at the doorway and said, "Mother, I used to think home was property. Now I know it is authority rightly held." He had learned. That was part of victory, too. In the weeks that followed, divorce was finalized, the trust amendments recorded, and the foundation announced a scholarship wing would bear Harold's and my names. The woman once deemed too embarrassing for Easter now chaired galas, controlled the estate, preserved a family fortune, restored stolen funds, and reshaped legacy law in her own household. The woman who tried to erase me had paid financially through restitution and asset liquidation, socially through public censure and exclusion, legally through binding findings and permanent disclosures. Every form of consequence had landed. Yet as the next Easter approached, I sensed the story required one final answer, not in documents or punishments, but in symbolism. Chloe asked whether we would host again. I looked at the long walnut table and said, "Bigger this year." Then a delivery arrived addressed in Vanessa's handwriting. Inside was the old silver Easter serving tray she had once mocked, polished to a mirror shine, with a note beneath it containing only 6 words. "It was always your table, Eleanor." I smiled, set the tray in the center of the table, and knew the ending had finally come. The following Easter, the walnut table ran the full length of the dining room and into the sunroom, 2 extension leaves added, 20 places set, every chair filled. Children's laughter moved through the orchard again. Chloe's scholarship students came from the nursing program. Daniel carved the ham where his father once stood, and the silver tray Vanessa had returned gleamed at the center beneath white lilies. But this was not merely another holiday restored. It was a coronation of truth. Before supper, Daniel rose and read aloud the formal dedication from the Whitmore Legacy Fund, now endowed by preserved royalties, recovered restitution, and family trust growth. The fund had already awarded its first grants. My name and Harold's would stand on the scholarship wing at the hospital. The orchard was protected in perpetuity. The farmhouse deed had been re-recorded with the matrilineal branch in place. There was no longer any question who held authority. It was written into law, land, and legacy. Yet the greatest payoff came not from what I possessed, but from what the world had witnessed. 3 weeks before Easter, the State Charity Commission published its final summary. Vanessa's misconduct findings became part of the permanent public record. Her financial penalties were satisfied only after asset liquidation, including the sale of the luxury condominium she had moved into after separation. Her consulting practice dissolved when remaining clients withdrew. The Country Club Committee removed her honorary privileges. The hospital foundation barred her from board service indefinitely. Not through gossip, through documented consequence. The woman who had once curated every social room she entered now found herself absent from them. Social exile can be quieter than scandal and far more enduring. Daniel finalized the divorce in late winter.
No appeals. No hidden levity.
Her claims against family holdings were waived in full. Even the attorneys who once treated her as strategic now treated her as resolved risk. Financially, she paid. Publicly, she fell. Legally, she was marked. Every form of consequence had landed exactly as truth demanded. But I had one final act left, and I had kept it for Easter. After dessert, I asked Chloe to bring the old recipe box. Inside, beside Harold's note, was a new trust amendment I had executed 2 days earlier. I announced before the whole table that I was transferring controlling stewardship of the orchard branch to a family council chaired jointly by me and Chloe, with Daniel as successor protector under terms Harold would have admired. No spouse, no outside influence, no opportunistic claim could ever again threaten the family table. Applause broke out before I had finished. Walter pounded the table and declared Harold was likely laughing somewhere. Then Daniel stood, glass in hand, and made the toast none of us will forget. My mother was told she was too embarrassing for Easter, he said, voice unsteady, and instead she rebuilt our family, saved our inheritance, exposed fraud, restored what was stolen, and taught me loyalty. Even now I can hear the silence after those words, the kind of silence that follows truth when it has nowhere left to prove itself. Then came the final surprise. Mrs. Parker handed me an envelope from the foundation. Inside was a resolution naming the annual spring legacy lecture in my honor. I laughed through tears and said I had only set a dinner table. Mrs. Parker leaned in and whispered, "No, Eleanor. You set a standard." Later, as dusk settled and lanterns glowed through the orchard, a car slowed at the road beyond the gate. I knew it before Chloe did. Vanessa. She did not come in. She remained behind the wheel for a long moment, looking toward the lit windows and the family she once tried to fracture. Then she drove away.
No confrontation. No plea.
Just a woman forced to witness what she could not conquer. And that, more than any courtroom or settlement, was the final judgment. She had tried to exile me from Easter and ended by watching from outside the gate while I presided over the very kingdom she meant to seize. When the last guests left and Daniel helped clear the dishes, I found the old place card I had made for Harold years ago tucked beside his chair. I left it there. Some presences do not need explanation. Before bed, I walked alone through the orchard, blossoms drifting in the dark, and understood something with absolute peace. I had not merely survived humiliation. I had reversed it. The woman called embarrassing became matriarch, benefactor, trustee, and honored founder. The woman who mocked tradition lost money, status, legal standing, and the social identity she worshipped. One gained everything that mattered. One paid everything she feared to lose. There was no ambiguity left.
No luoses red.
No wound still negotiating closure. Only justice, complete and satisfying. And every Easter since, when new, guests ask why there is one silver tray always placed in the center before anyone sits down. Chloe smiles and tells them, that is where truth is served first. And I think that may be the finest ending of all.